The RetroUSB wireless Gamepad is a microswitched aftermarket NES controller released in 2017, shortly after the RetroUSB AVS. The NES had bad aftermarket controllers, that's simply a fact. But this is a relatively unique one since it's targeting the high-end market, usually running between $55 and $65. This controller is interesting because it's not only trying to imitate, but improve upon the NES controller that everyone knows and loves, by adding both tactile microswitches and low-latency wireless. To give a brief background on my tastes, I'm very picky with my controllers, and I only use first-party controllers, unless it's a cheap peripheral like a dance pad or a joystick where I look to the aftermarket for higher quality options. I am one of the very few people who complained about the NES Classic controller, and no, it's not a perfect recreation of an NES controller. I'm also a big fan of microswitches. I usually prefer Seimitsu joysticks to Sanwa for Japanese arcade games, and I'm typing now on a keyboard I built custom with Kale Box Jade switches, some of the clickiest on the market anywhere. Tactile feedback is generally something I value very much. As far as wireless goes, that's not really something I value. All of my retro consoles are hooked up with first-party wired controllers, and that's just something I expect to deal with. The selling feature to me on this controller was the more tactile gameplay. Immediately when picking the controller up, I think it feels cheap, especially for the premium price. It doesn't feel as cheap as one of the Retro Fighter controllers if you have one of those, but this thing costs 6 times as much as an NES Classic controller, and it doesn't really feel like it. While you're paying attention to it, you'll notice the button presses pinging around the hollow plastic housing, although this fades into the background during gameplay. Also, if you shake it, it sounds rattly because there's no rubber pads cushioning the impact, but that's not really a big deal at all. So it's got these fancy wings, which both makes it look pretty damn ugly and it makes you wonder about the ergonomics. What immediately came to my mind when I saw it was the PS3 Boomerang controller. But sometimes stupid-looking devices have great ergonomics, so I reserved my judgment, and I don't think the wings are a big deal. I don't really see the purpose of them, and I don't think they improve the ergonomics, but when I hold the controller, my middle fingers wrap around them, and my other fingers kind of partially wrap around them. They're not big enough to wrap your entire hand around like an Xbox controller. So it's kind of this halfway point between better ergonomics and no improvement at all. And it will possibly turn off ultra purists, so overall it's a questionable design choice in my opinion, but personally they really don't bother me. The microswitched buttons and D-pad aren't stiff, but they're noticeably heavier than the original controller rubber buttons. There are 2 big differences here, the feel and the actuation force. The original NES rubber domes have a more gradual force curve. You press the D-pad and it gives a bit until you press it all the way down. In a word, it's mushy. The microswitches are the opposite. You put pressure on them and virtually nothing happens until you get to the actuation point, and then the switch crashes down all at once and the button press registers. This crashing through sensation provides the tactile feedback. In a word, it's crisp. On top of that, the switches themselves require more force to actuate than the original NES rubber domes. I don't have super scientific gear, but I do have this ancient force meter that's like from the 1960s, so maybe don't take these readings literally, but in a relative sense. Pressing the D-pad of the RetroUSB controller takes just under 200 grams of force. And the buttons take around 150 grams of force to actuate. The original NES D-pad takes just under 150 grams of force to actuate, and the buttons around 100 grams. Now, 25 to 50% sounds like a big increase, and it is, but this comes with the caveat that the tactile feedback means you know exactly when a button is registered. You'll never press an NES D-pad exactly 130 grams or whatever for it to register, you're just gonna slam your finger down in the heat of the moment until it bottoms out. So it might not be quite as dramatic as the measurements say, but overall I would say the real-world experience of using this is slightly stiffer and more tiring on the finger than an original controller. So the important thing, how does this controller feel to actually play with? I don't think there's a single good or bad answer to give here, it very much depends on the game. I think this controller absolutely shines where single, precise, technical inputs are required. You may have been skeptical of Mike Tyson's Punch-Out with a wireless controller, but it's the single best game I've played on this controller. In a game where every millisecond counts, you get that tactile feel of your D-pad press the moment it actuates, so you can immediately release it to do a quick dodge. I'm gonna say this controller actually improved my Tyson gameplay. Tetris, or really any puzzle game, is another great example. If it's a game where you make individual presses on the D-pad without holding it or rolling it, I think the controller is exceptional. And that's the highest praise I could really give this controller. There are games in which I prefer it to a regular NES controller, which I've used my entire life. After using this controller, it actually feels kinda crazy going back to a regular NES controller because it's just so mushy in comparison once you're used to those sharp clicks. Lots of NES games are platform and action games, and for these I'm not as glowingly positive about this. It's not a bad experience, but it takes some getting used to. Ninja Gaiden 3 is perhaps the game I'm most familiar with on NES. I play it all the time, and I played noticeably worse on the RetroUSB controller, especially my first time through. There's no specific reason I can point to for this. My guess is mostly muscle memory and the slightly heavier inputs. I think most people would get used to it after a point, but I really don't see an advantage to doing so, whereas in Punch-Out, the game immediately felt better to play. If wireless is the main selling point of the controller to you, I think most games play fine with it, and it's probably worth getting used to for the sake of wireless. Since I'm purely using it for gameplay feel, these games are out for me. And then there's the worst category of games that require diagonals or a lot of touchy inputs. Diagonals are weird, and I'm gonna say they're outright bad. Here's where my extreme pickiness with controllers is really gonna come into play. All NES D-pads have a certain amount of rotational wobble in them. I've complained about this on the NES Classic controllers. Regular NES controllers are hit and miss, but some is always there. And to be 100% clear, the RetroUSB controller is perhaps the most rotationally stable D-pad I've seen on an NES controller. But the little that is there comes into play, so I want to mention what I'm talking about. Say you're running as Mario and you want to duck and slide under something. So we're switching from right to down right. On the original NES controller, you're holding right and you roll your thumb to down. The rubber holds the face of the D-pad in place while you roll your thumb down. The D-pad smoothly rolls with you until you're pressing both right and down. Two things happened here. The rubber held the D-pad so it didn't rotate, and the mushiness I mentioned before, which may seem like a negative adjective in most cases, it actually makes this motion feel more natural. On the RetroUSB controller, the microswitches on the D-pad don't hold it in place, there's just not as much friction there. The D-pad might give a slight rotational shift before or after it registers the new direction. And just to be 100% clear, I'm trying to exaggerate for effect here. This provides the tactile sensation of a slight rotational shift along with the sharp click as you press down. And I might even describe this shift as sticky. While rolling from one direction to another, when the D-pad makes its very small amount of rotation, you might feel that rotation stick in one or two distinct spots rather than happen as one smooth shift. This provides multiple tactile sensations when switching directions, on top of the sharp click, which really removes the benefit of the tactile feel here. It's not really an audible problem, but I might describe the feeling of a rolling directional shift as creaky. You know when you're trying to close a door as smoothly as possible, but you get those sticking points in the hinges that you have to power through, and it's like, That's what this reminds me of. The tactile sensation here makes it distinctly less natural than a regular NES controller, even for reasons beyond it being a clicky transition instead of a smooth one. In my opinion, this is the controller's biggest weakness. Diagonals in general really aren't the best. When you go from centered to diagonal, if you don't do it perfectly, you get the 1-2 feeling as the switches actuate at different times, and I don't really like that. Also, pressing two directions at once also of course means that increased actuation force per switch is doubled, so again it just takes that little bit more effort than a regular NES controller. As far as games with frequent touchy inputs like Marble Madness, I think the clicks in general are just distracting, both audibly and tactily. Just a few more things to mention. I had no issue using a USB adapter on my computer. I had no build quality issues. I know there are other reviews out there that had housing issues or D-pad issues, but mine is perfect. And I also had no issues with any buttons not registering, nothing like that. Everything's pretty much been perfect with the controller. It has a mini USB charger, which is frankly ridiculous for any product that came out in the last decade. But it's supposed to have this 100-hour battery life, and I've only charged it very infrequently. I've never run out of battery, so probably not a big deal there. Supposedly the RF wireless goes a great distance, although I haven't tested anything bigger than the living room. I can tell you it works perfectly anywhere. And if I haven't made it clear by saying Punch-Out is my favorite game to play on this, I do not notice any input lag. I don't have the means to technically measure this, and I can't beat Mike Tyson to prove it simply because I lack the skills to beat Mike Tyson. But at least I could bring him to the third round. The controller works. Subjectively, I think this controller has improved my Punch-Out play, if anything. I don't like subjectively talking about input lag because there are so many people who BS about that, but yeah, I can't tell any input lag. It also has 4 wireless channels, so you can use up to 4 at once, and turbo functionality, all of which I've never tried because I don't really care. I'm sure it works. Is the RetroUSB wireless controller worth $55 to $65? I would say probably not in general. There are specific use cases for it which I love. That is, puzzle games, Punch-Out, or, I'm sure you'd have no issue playing Ultima Exodus or Final Fantasy with this. But for the majority of the NES library as a daily driver, I think it ranges from acceptable to noticeably worse, especially when it comes to rolling the D-pad. While for the majority of games, I don't think it would be a big deal getting used to this clicky controller, with things like the 8-bit DOE wireless controller kit, which you can install into a real NES controller, wireless isn't really a unique benefit of this controller. So the only reason I can really see using one is the gameplay feel. So hopefully you can find a niche for this controller in your gameplay like I did. Other than that, I'll personally be sticking to my tried and true NES 004. Thanks for watching.